Good morning, everyone. Glad you joined us again today. Happy Mother's Day to all your mothers out there. Jana, and I guess we have Lauren already. I see that the two of you have chimed in, and there are others that have joined us already as well. Happy Mother's Day to all of you. This morning, we're going to continue our series on how God has revealed himself, and specifically in the last several lessons in the person of Jesus Christ. And this morning, we're going to talk about things that have to do with purity. We're going to show how God is pure, how Jesus was pure, and how his apostles taught us to be pure also. But first of all, I want to begin by just talking about purity as an idea. And the best way I have of doing that is to go back to my old lab days and think about chemical purity. So I want to use chemical purity as a model for thinking about spiritual purity. And I'll start off by saying that purity in a chemistry laboratory is an ideal, but it's not an achievable goal. First of all, it's time consuming and costly to improve. You can improve purity and you can try to strive for 100% purity, but in the chemical sense, every scientist knows that you'll never actually reach chemical purity right down to the last molecule. It's really quite impossible. Second thing I'd say is that the closer you get to it, the more difficult and costly it becomes to achieve it. Achieving 90% purity may be possible. Achieving 95% may also be possible, but it will cost more and it will be more difficult. It'll require improved techniques. It'll require improved apparatus. Achieving 99% is harder. 99.9% is even more and more difficult. And when you get out to 3 nines, you're probably about as close to the purity of any substance that you're ever possibly going to achieve, because the very processes that you use to try to achieve purity end up preventing you from reaching it. Some impurities are intractable. Alcohol from water can reach a maximum purity of 95.6% by multiple pass distillation. Distill alcohol and water as many times as you want to. You'll never surpass this standard. Why? Because alcohol is particularly difficult to remove from water. They like each other. And so to get water and alcohol to separate requires other techniques besides distillation. You have to go to other means of making that happen, because distillation alone won't do it, no matter how many times, no matter how hard you try. With significant expenditure of energy and perfection of apparatus and technique, you can get what you might call high purity. And when you buy a high purity solvent from a scientific supplier, you're probably going to get something that's 99.9+% pure, and it's going to cost probably many times, perhaps 10 times as much as what you would pay for that simple solvent if it hasn't been through all those purification steps. And as I said at the beginning, try as we might, absolute purity will never be reached. Now, I hope you can see in those steps that I just took you through, in that logical development that I just took you through, that there's an analogy between chemical purity and spiritual purity. Who could ever, at any point in their life, say that they've reached that point of spiritual maturity where they have become absolutely pure, that there's no impurity left in their heart at all, that they've removed all of it? So we have to recognize going into this discussion that this kind of purity is a goal. Jesus set up this goal, and he didn't give us any permission not to reach it. He never said it's okay if you never reach purity in regards to this idea or that idea, this trait or that trait. No, he holds that goal up there and he says, this is the goal I'd like you to achieve. While at the same time, we recognize that we'll never get there. But then how do you approach purity if you don't have it as a goal? How do you come close to being pure? How do you remove impurities if you don't have purity as an ideal? So because this is fun, I wanted to show you what the apparatus is. If you wanted to achieve the absolute purity, the most pure solvent that you could possibly achieve, if you wanted to get the purest water, for example, that you could use in a laboratory experiment, this is the apparatus you'd use. It requires 3 distillations. And so you can see 3 distillation flasks here, this huge one on the left, and then there's 2 smaller ones down at the bottom on the right, one stacked in front of the other one. And it takes a tremendous amount of energy to run that thing. And this is just to get pure water, just to get water that is of the highest level of purity. And then even after you've been through this and after you paid $25,000 for this all glass, Teflon, and stainless steel device, you still have impurities in the water at the end of the day. I have a few slides that I've stuck in here this time to help me find those of you who've been with us from the beginning have noticed how I've had to struggle to find my slides from time to time. So I stuck a few place markers in here for myself so that it's easier for me to see from my side where I'm at in the slides. Maybe I won't get lost as often. So before Jesus came to the earth, before the Advent, how were the motives of God known? I want to remind you of a logical progression that I took you through in the last class. And I want to change that slightly and ask the same question using the same slide. The Old Testament can be viewed through 2 lenses. We can see the calamity of God brought down upon the disobedient, or we can see how God used calamity to reform the disobedient. This speaks, as you understand, this speaks to the motives of God in the bad things that have happened to people over time. People, we very often say, why are these bad things happening to us? Why did those bad things happen to the Jews? Well, God had reasons. We don't always know what the reasons are, but he always had some. And when the motives of God are finally revealed, we find that his motives were right. His motives were good for the things that he did. And so we learn to trust God, and we learn to think about the possible good motives that God would have for the bad things that happen to us, for the things that we go through. And so I want to use as a case in point the exile of the Israelites. Now we imagine God having said this about you. Now therefore say to the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, thus saith the Lord, behold, I am shaping disaster against you and devising a plan against you. If you ever hear God say that about you, the hairs on the back of your neck should stand up. Can you imagine God planning a disaster against you? Devising a plan against you? So he says, return everyone from his evil way and amend your ways and your deeds. So you see the motive for God's planning and shaping disaster against the people is stated almost parenthetically at the end of this statement, I'm shaping disaster against you. And if we just read the first part of that verse and didn't think about the second part of it, we could end up assigning improper motives to God. And people do that with the Old Testament, don't they? Very often people read the Old Testament and they see the things that God did and they assign evil motives to him. And they'll even say, I refuse to serve a God who has those kinds of motives. Well, judging the motives of others is always dangerous. And misjudging the motives of God, of course, is the ultimate danger. Who among us likes to have our motives misjudged? Okay, now if we continued reading in the book of Jeremiah, where those verses came from, this is what we would find. In chapter 29, verses 10 and 11, for thus says the Lord, when the exile, that is, when the 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you. I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. These are words that Christians very often put on plaques on their wall. It makes a good bumper sticker. But if you consider what was happening to the Israelites at the time that these words were spoken, it was not a pretty picture. The Israelites were about to be destroyed by another nation. Their eyes were going to be gouged out. They were going to be chained in a string, and they were going to be marched off across the desert sand to a faraway land and become servants of another people for the next 70 years. It was at that time and under those conditions that the Lord said to them that he had plans for them, plans for their betterment. But they had to go through this difficult time in order to get there. So what kind of confidence do you have in God when you read those passages in the Old Testament that seem to indicate, makes you wonder about God's motives and why would he be so harsh and why would he be so cruel? It's not difficult if we think the most of God, if we think the best of him, as we should of all people at all times, to understand their motives for what they do, even things that we don't approve of, even things that are wrong perhaps. At least we can understand people better if we try to understand their motives for the things that they do and assign better motives to them. And then we'll hate people less. It'll be easier for us to love them more. Okay, this was all illustrated and taught by Jesus Christ. So through Jesus, how was the purity of God demonstrated? Well, first of all, let's just think about Jesus. And I'm going to leave that slide hanging there for just a moment while I talk through this with you. Jesus said that what comes out of a man indicates what's inside him. Jesus' own pure heart yielded only purity of speech. His words built people up or corrected them. He never lashed out at anyone for the sake of cutting them down or injuring them. He genuinely cared even for those who wished evil upon him. He asked his Father to forgive even those who crucified him. Likewise, his actions were commensurate with his words. He never took anything away from anyone, physically injured anyone, cheated anyone out of anything, or owed anyone anything. All his acts were acts of kindness, healing, restoration, redemption, mercy, and grace. Even his hard words were for restoration and correction and spoken with the same spirit of grace. The reason these observations are true about Jesus is because he was possessed of the purest of motivators, the love that came down from his Father. It was the Father who loved the world, who so loved the world that he gave us Jesus. It was Jesus who so loved the world that he went to the cross when driven by love. As your sole motive, it turns out that the things you say and do towards others are in their best interests. That's who Jesus was, and it's who he expects us to be. Look at these verses with me. Luke chapter 6, verses 43 through 45. The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of heart, his mouth speaks. So what comes out of our mouth and what comes from our actions is a result of what's inside of us. What was inside Jesus? Purity. The only true purity, the purity that came down from God. For the rest of us, it's a goal. It's not going to be a reality. But if we love God and if we love others, it will produce this purity of motive. It will be that purity, pure motive, and it will produce purity of actions. The apostolic writings are full of these kinds of things. And so we're just going to read through a few verses here together. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. This is a very high standard of purity. Let no corrupting. Now, let me just insert something about the DDV, the Durell Dobbins version. I put it in brackets so that you know that I'm intercalating a word here that I think is probably a better translation of what the author is saying. The ESV comes very close, I think, to showing the contrast between two ideas that the original author, meaning the Holy Spirit, through the Apostle Paul, is trying to get across. He's trying to contrast two ideas. He just contrasted working with stealing, and now he's contrasting corrupting talk with edifying talk. And so I inserted the word degrading, because that's a word that we might use to describe the kind of speech that he's referring to here. Let no degrading talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for, what's the opposite of degrading? For building up, as fits the occasion, and that it may give grace to those who hear. Look at this carefully. Only the things that come out of your mouth should only be those things that are, one, good for building up, number two, fitting to the occasion, and number three, give grace to those who hear. Some people have no filters. They don't filter out false talk. They don't filter out degrading talk. Whatever comes across their mind, they spill it. We know who those people are because they're the most obvious people in the society around us. Everybody knows who they are. They have no filters on what they say. But this is a very high level of filter, a very high level of purification that the writer is asking us to apply to our speech. And I tell you, I didn't grow up practicing in this discipline. And it can be hard for me even yet to apply these filters to the things that I say. Let no degrading talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, and that it may give grace to those who hear. Now consider the person who has only one filter. The filter, is it true or is it not? Well, that's a good filter to apply, but that which is true doesn't always give grace to those who hear, does it? Someone says to me, do you like my dress? Well, there are a number of ways that I can answer that question. One is I can say, that's the ugliest piece of cloth I've ever seen on the back of man or beast. Now that may be true, but it doesn't fit the occasion, and it doesn't give grace to the one who hears. So, what is a way that I could say the same thing that does build people up, fit the occasion, and give grace to those who hear? I think with very little effort, you and I could probably come up with a way of doing that so that people are built up rather than torn down. And that's something we all need to practice. Next verse. Again, Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. Colossians being so much like the book of Ephesians in so many ways. Almost taught from the same roadmap, but through a slightly different lens. Let your speech be always gracious, seasoned with salt. I love that verbal imagery, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer each person. So it's not just that you're speaking gracious words, but this indicates some effort on the part of the speaker, doesn't it? You're speaking gracious words in a way that the hearer can best hear them and benefit from them, seasoned with salt. And then thirdly, a harsh criticism of those who don't do these kinds of things, don't filter their speech. If anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, that person's religion is worthless. Those are very strong words for people who refuse to filter their speech. So, as Lawrence just taught us in our last lesson on Wednesday night, our speech is kind of an indicator of the way the direction that our life will go. If we're able to perfect our speech, then we're able to perfect our whole body also. Okay, let me do a brief break here and just check. I haven't been getting any, I haven't started a Q&A. Let me go ahead and start that so that if anybody wants to type a question in, you're welcome to do that now while we're taking a little break. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to describe what the product of this spiritual purification process will look like. First of all, let's describe the pure life of Christ, as we did in a paragraph just a few minutes ago. It begins with a pure heart. Such a heart produces pure motives. Now let's look at these carefully. Pure motives, purity of motives would be characterized by the absence of malice. You have no evil intent towards another person. There's no vindictiveness. You're not trying to get even for anything. There's no competitiveness. You're not trying to push somebody else down so that you can show that you're better. I tell you, competition does as much to kill any relationship as any single concept that you can think of. People competing for power in a relationship, for who's the most right, or who's right the most often, for who's right this time most often. Envy. You would lack suspicion towards other people. If we're assigning the best possible motives to other people, we won't be suspicious of them. So a pure heart would produce pure motives, and those motives would lack all of those elements that we're talking about there. The pure heart will shine through in the things that we say. There'll be an absence of angry words, degrading words, boastful words, or gossipy speech. Now, I tell you, every one of us is sitting here right now identifying in ourselves the kinds of things that we're talking about. And if we're to improve in the area of purity, we're going to have to recognize these things in ourselves and ask ourselves, where are these things coming from? And the answer will always take us back to our motives, and our motives will take us back to our heart. Evil things can't proceed from a pure heart. Only good things, only pure things, only loving things can emanate from a pure heart. So if we trace these things backwards, okay, and the pure heart will finally, the pure motives, the pure speech, they'll be exercised in pure actions. There will be an absence of manipulation. You know what I'm talking about. Emotionally, leveraging your emotions to get people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, trying to shoehorn people into doing things that they wouldn't otherwise do, undermining people, cutting the legs out from somebody else, throwing them under the bus in order to make yourself look better, plotting against people. If you ever find yourself conniving ways to get your way over somebody else this way or that, being vengeful, gamesmanship, or actually doing emotional or bodily harm to another person. This would kind of be at the bodily harm would kind of be at the extreme of the emotional harm that is often perpetrated on others, even those who are closest to us. With a pure heart, these actions will self-correct. But if you're finding any of these indicators of impurity in your heart, take note of the one or the ones that you have the most trouble with and trace it back to your heart and see if you can put forth the effort and through a connection with the vine, a closer walk with God, see if you can eliminate those impure motives, those impure speech patterns, those impure actions that are marring your life, that are preventing you from achieving the kind of purity that we saw in Jesus Christ. Okay, let me check my questions and check my questions again. None yet. Okay. I don't know if people can't find the questions. You have to scroll down on your screen to get to them. I don't know if people don't have questions. We haven't had any much throughout this series. That's okay if you'd rather just go along for the ride, but if you have questions, we'd be glad to hear them. All right, so here's a little graphic that I think will help to illustrate what I've been trying to say, that it all begins with the heart. That a heart produces motives. That motives produce speech. That speech produces actions. And it's a cascade. Water flows downhill and the cascade flows downhill. Whatever is in your heart, that is what your heart is giving off. It is flowing downstream to motives. Motives naturally emanate from the heart. Speech naturally emanates from motives, and actions naturally emanate from motives and speech. So once the impurities are in the heart, those impurities are going to work their way out in our motives, our speech, and our actions. It's going to happen. Just as sure as water runs downhill, just as sure as gravity pulls things towards the center of the earth, actions, speech, and motives will come forth from whatever is in your heart. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. The further upstream, then, we can identify and diffuse problems, the less harm will be done to ourselves and others, and the more maturity we will evidence to those around us. The further upstream we can identify and diffuse problems, the less harm will be done to ourselves and to others, and the more maturity we will evidence to those around us. And this is very important. We must constantly bear in mind that although purity is something we strive to achieve to be pleasing to God, we cannot be saved through this endeavor. We cannot be saved through this endeavor. If salvation could have come through adherence to law, the old law would have been perfect. But it was not perfect because it was lacking in one important element. It was viewed as salvation through law, which people could never perfect, rather than salvation through grace. Now let's go back to our laboratory analogy. The chemistry laboratory is very unforgiving, very unforgiving. If you make mistakes, they're going to show up in your product. It's going to be clear that it's in your product. You're going to be able to do a test and find out that it's in there. And you got to go back and you got to do whatever it takes to get that out of there. There's no grace. It's terribly unforgiving. You either made it to 100% purity or you didn't. And it's a rather frustrating thing because you know you're not going to. And when you make a mistake, you're even going to come further from it than you ever thought you would. Fortunately, for us, our relationship with God is not like that. Absolute purity is something that cannot be achieved. God knows that we're not going to achieve it. He knows we're going to fall short of it. And he gave us Jesus so that we could have grace. He gave us, through Jesus, he gave us forgiveness. He gave us mercy. He gave us the ability to right our wrongs, to be pure in the absence of impurities, or in the presence of impurities. How does he do that? Through his sacrifice and his pure motive and God's desire to be reconciled to us provided for us a way, even in our impurity, to be reckoned as pure. Some people are still trying to achieve that purity through their own excellence. You've got the wrong motive for what you're trying to do. You'll never be in a position where you can say, okay, God, I've made it. I've become 100% pure. Now you have to accept me. Whether you're very good at this or whether you're really bad at it, whether you've been doing it for 30 years or whether you've just started on your path. In either case, you have impurities, and those impurities are removed only through the grace of Jesus Christ. But you'll agree that if we love God and if we want to be pleasing to him, that we're going to strive for purity. We're going to do, on our best day, everything that we can to try to be pleasing to him and to try to maintain that purity, knowing that we're going to fall short, but just simply because we want to be pleasing to God. And that's the way it should be. We should want to do well for God. We should want to represent him well. We should want to have a closer relationship with him that's available through these actions, through these motives, through pure speech, recognizing that we're going to fall short and relying upon grace for the whole thing. And one of the greatest religious failures is the failure to realize that you're in need of that grace, or to somehow believe that you have achieved a greater purity than is even available to you, or that you have somehow earned this relationship with God on your own. So God loves purity. He loves it when we strive to be pure. He wants us to put forth that effort. He knows that we'll never achieve it, and he's given us grace. And he wants us to be fully aware that when we're saved, that it's not going to be because we've achieved purity. It's going to be because of the grace that he offers. Otherwise, it would seem ungrateful, wouldn't it, to accept the grace of Christ and claim it as though you had done it yourself. And so we end the class with this. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Thank you for joining us again today. Let me do a quick check and see if I have any questions that have come in. John Rogers, there are many passages on listening rather than speaking, but I can still have bad motives while being silent, right? That's true. Some of us stew in our own juices, don't we, Jonna? Something will happen that will anger us, or we may harbor ill feelings that we never allow them to bubble up to the surface or to work their way out, but we can still have those evil thoughts and intents in our heart, can't we? And maybe we have a exceptional ability to cover that up. But when we go through hard times, when we go through difficulties, those evil thoughts and intents that we have in our heart have a way of bubbling up to the surface. Okay. Thank you for that question. And I'm not seeing any comments, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off early and allow you a few extra minutes to be ready for the morning service. Thank you for participating with us again this morning. It's been a pleasure to teach it, and I hope that we'll be back together again soon and be back in our classes. You'll be hearing more from us soon about that. Have a good day. See you again later.